Welcome back to a new episode of Follow the Rabbit, where we decode cultural phenomena and investigate emerging trends to help you update your mental models of the world. Seems like a real-time job these days. I'm reading The Economist, and I'm like, yeah, that was a thing 2 days ago. I think it's a rough time to be a journalist outside of, I guess, Blue Sky and Twitter. We're gonna come back to that. So today is once again like our monthly review session where we pick out a couple of articles, podcasts, whatever we stumble upon that stayed with us through the month. And to get us started, Igor, if I read my notes correctly, you want to talk about wrestling. Care to elaborate?
Well, yeah. Welcome back from my side as well. Hello. What I want to talk about wrestling, or need to, I think, is points that we need to discuss. But yes, we are talking a little bit about wrestling today. And to be perfectly honest, we are recording this on a Tuesday morning, which it means that we had the opportunity to watch a Jon Stewart Monday evening take on what is happening in the United States, which I think most of you have kind of been occupied with, at least partially, because how could you not? After what happened last week with Trump, J.D. Vance, and Vladimir Zelensky in the Oval Office, I think there is a lot of upheaval and really kind of like recontextualizing of what is happening in the world or how our world is actually working. I think there many takes on this, many good ones, many interesting ones. Often they are quite short-sighted, I have to say, and especially like in the German media, there is a lot of pretense of being caught off guard or being surprised.
Who could have seen this coming?
Exactly. And it's kind of, I mean, we'll get to that as well. Like, as Johannes alluded, we're talking about how interesting media companies are operating. Let's not bash the ones that are not doing well anyway. There is a take in this Jon Stewart episode where he basically explains everything that has happened with Vladimir Zelensky through the viewpoint of wrestling. And he has a very kind of like specific example, a recent example really of how this constellation is kind of operating. And the reason why he is mentioning that is because Trump obviously has a really long history with wrestling, and he's been associated with Vince McMahon for a very long time. He was part of the wrestling empire. Vince McMahon's wife, the wife of a guy who went to prison because he did a lot of bad things, is a member of the Trump government. So I'm just kind of like alluding to that in full kind of context, is that this is not just an kind of isolated example or anything like that. There is a really strong history of that. And a history that both Johannes and I have been tracking with or amusement and all the other emotions that you can have in that context, since a kind of small article appeared in the New York Times in 2016 with the simple title, "Is Everything Wrestling?" And it turns out, yes, the short answer. The point of the article is that it basically kind of like looks through what is happening, how certain political behaviors, societal behaviors are more or less mimicking what is pretty much an entertainment empire where we are accepting fake reality as actual reality because we're able to suspend our own disbelief. And why? Because it's easier to suspend your disbelief into a fake reality than deal with the actual one. And I think that interconnectedness between wrestling, media, attention, we talked a little bit about, we're amusing ourselves to death, a book from the 1980s that is still highly recommended to anyone who is trying to get their hands on what is happening today. And I think in the beginning, we wanted to acknowledge that everything is kind of crazy right now. And there is, we have our own ways, like in a way, Johannes and I have also different ways, but ours are after doing this together for a very long time. Ours are kind of similar. I think we're acknowledging the fact that it's really hard to deal with, what is happening every day. I think you need to pay attention to what is needed to you. But if you're looking through kind of focal points, point of views, I think picking up a book like We're Amusing Ourselves to Death will at least, probably will make you a little bit angry, because it's like so clear what is happening since the 80s and nobody actually did anything about it. On the contrary, one could say people kind of leaned into the problems instead of leaning away. But it will give you a good point of view that will help you deal with understanding why are the Democrats not doing what they're supposed to be doing? Why is the American society, for example, not reacting and, doing like protesting all the time? There are a lot of things that we can take out of this book and this article, to which we will obviously link.
Yeah, so we will link to the article, the Daily Show episode, which it's really just really highly recommended viewing right now. It is a really good segment, and I think it makes some parts very clear. Also of the whole idea behind Trump's behavior, JD Vance's behavior. I think it's very helpful in that. And we just to sum it up,
don't spoil it.
Yeah. No. I'm not spoiling. No. I'm summing up your point is this lens of wrestling, of these good and bad and changing sides. I mean, to just spoil one thing in this wrestling metaphor, The Rock is Putin. Just so to give you it's really worth watching that. And it's it's once again, it's interesting how it once again is the comedians who are going where it feels like a lot of journalists and talking heads can't go, because they have to keep, I don't know, the suspense, or actually not really
pretense,
working.
Really.
The pretense. And so, yeah, there's, I think attention economy is going to be one of the threads running through this year, because it's so helpful to look at that. I mean, for me, the thing that this thing in the White House ended with Trump saying this is really good television, gives away the whole thing.
I mean, but kind of to round it off, I think the takeaway, if you watch this segment and if you read the article, it is really important to understand that nothing, even if it looks random and super emotional, nothing of it is. It is not random. It is a scripted reality. Even if you don't think Trump engages in that actively, which, to a certain degree is true, but his instincts are about understanding how scripted realities operate. And there are people who are very kind of keen on scripting a certain reality, and they're engaging that. And I think it's important to understand how this works, how this scripted reality that they're trying to, manifest really is affecting us all.
Yeah. So and if you watch that episode, there's a good chance that you have a strong need to get away from it all, and you wouldn't be alone in that, because we also today want to pick up one very interesting signal that ties in with all of what we've talked about, third places and health as the new luxury, and that is soft clubbing.
Yeah.
What the hell, Igor? What the hell?
Well, when it's one of those things that if you're not interested in those topics, it's probably you would have not noticed the term. But when I saw it fly by on my feed, this essay, I saw the term soft clubbing. I was like, thank you, because it kind of captures so many things. So the essay was written by Yusuf Tahilian. I'm not quite sure if I pronounced that right, but I'm hoping I came close. He is a creative strategist, writer, and model from London, but he kind of oscillates between London and Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. And he wrote this small-ish essay, the year 2025, the year of soft clubbing. And I decided instead of I kind of will just read from his definition of the term. So I term this shift soft clubbing, he says, describing the desire to experience a curated sonic atmosphere without being confined to a traditional event space, let alone a full-on club experience. Soft clubbing speaks to the shift in our social needs in a post-pandemic world, the very same needs that had led to a rise in run clubs and hobby clubs such as chess and bowling. Previously, the club was an adequate provider of your weekly dose of social interaction, a space to dance, socialize, and for many to get intoxicated too. I don't know what she speaks about. However, for a generation that is drinking less and desiring more socially, the club is no longer the primary medium for our social needs. People are demanding deeper connections, turning to communal spaces to fulfill these needs. Only a few things bring people together like music. That's why curated sonic experiences are still finding their way into these communal spaces and therefore redefining how we experience music. So he kind of basically paints this picture of, and he has plenty of examples of how basically this changes. And he mentioned, like, as he wrote, like he mentioned, like, run clubs and so forth. And he mentions something that we also talked about in our early kind of like season, the reemergence of like listening bars, or in many cases, like Berlin, for example, it's not a reemergence. It's really like a formation of listening bars because they haven't been really quite the same here. On the contrary, we had like a bunch of jazz clubs, for example, which kind of like moved away or closed down. So they're basically all those venues where you can experience music that wasn't a live concert or a club, had certainly even like 15 years ago already kind of like a retreat in a way. Now we're kind of coming back to the idea that music plays a central role in communal experiences that are not clubbing in a city that is very much kind of built its reputation on being kind of like the club capital in the world, or at least a presumptive captain of the industry. But the reason, obviously, if you're a listener, you know that we kind of focused a lot on third places last year. So basically all those examples of where people are reconvening, socializing, finding meaning really in their all digital lives, physical experiences like reading rhymes where people came together to read a book for an hour and then talk to a stranger. It was something that was super interesting to us last year, and it is still interesting to us this year. And I think like soft clubbing is a really great example of a layer that builds on top of certain behavior. But that other example that he has in his definition, that generation of drinking less and being more mindful of their health, is something that we also kind of looked into quite a lot last year through the vantage point of health as a new luxury, the trend kind of like that encapsulates massive kind of changes in behavior, consumption behavior, for example, as well, throughout all generations. But it's kind of interesting that younger generations are super focused on not, just being healthy right now, but kind of investing their money into staying healthy, being aware that if you do it now, it actually helps you later. And so there is definitely a shift in behavior in that regard. And I think that's exemplified in his kind of point of view that people want to socialize, but they don't want to necessarily drink all night. They want to go clubbing or experience kind of a form of electronic music or gathering, but they can do that, as he kind of points out, like in bakeries during the day. There are a lot of different kind of examples in his essay where people are basically just starting super early, like it's an after work thing. I actually made fun of a small thing that's happening in Berlin as well, just last week, where Dean and David, and for those who are not from Berlin or Germany, Dean and David is kind of a health-focused restaurant chain. It's very, very like systemic gastronomy. It's not it's a thing that you go to when you're at an airport or a central station, um, fresh-ish food that is kind of healthy.
A lot of bowls and smoothies.
Exactly. Bowls and smoothies. Dean and David is cooperating with Lieferando, which is not necessarily where you kind of go shopping for healthy food necessarily, because Lieferando made their claim to fame through being just, delivery company for, and that's not the greatest food alive, but, and kind of also destroying a lot of restaurants, but that's a whole different topic. They're collaborating on a run and rave kind of thing where you meet up on a Saturday, to go for a run together as a group and then rave at the Dean and David for like 2 hours and then go home. So you get up at 8 in the morning on a Saturday, go for a run with a bunch of strangers, party with them, I guess have a smoothie, and then a bowl, and then go home. Which is, it's easy to make fun of because it's like such a brutal and kind of like inelegant way of exploiting a certain trend. But it is a really great manifestation of an example of how brands are kind of like reacting to certain behaviors and trying to make sense of how to deal with that. So soft clubbing, if you want to take something away from kind of this, is certainly a way of describing a certain behavior with a certain group of people, even if it's not an all-encompassing trend, because yes, people are on the one hand interested in staying healthy, being healthy, but at the same time, we're also seeing rising numbers in cigarette consumptions with younger generations in Europe as well. So, everything everywhere all at once.
Yeah, I think there's this one line that in the article where he says, in a post-pandemic world, IRL is the new counterculture. I think there's also a huge aspect about dating that's part of that appeal, where I think younger generations are really fed up with dating apps and trying to find new ways. The actual wall in Brooklyn where people would post up profiles and things like that to find connection. And I think when I listened to you, I was thinking like the only place right now where younger generations are experiencing pumping music is in soul cycle classes, things like that. That's where they're like, go! And then when they actually want to like have a good experience, enjoy themselves, and most importantly, talk to other humans, then they want to have a nice setting, a relaxed setting. They want to have good music that makes for a great atmosphere. It's interesting for me. I mostly observe this trend through the DJ sets that I see on my YouTube For You page. And it's like, it really like, it used to be all of these like crazy boiler room sets and things like that. And it's interesting how it shifted to much more. Here's like a morning coffee set. And then you really see a DJ in like a coffee shop just spinning like really atmospheric, good music, and people in the back just having a good time. I mean, I when I read this article, I thought about all these like rooftop. My head blanks on the guy's name with the famous boiler room set.
Well, there's
Fred again. It's God damn it, I'm getting old. So Fred again does all these like if you go to his YouTube channel, he does a lot of these like super relaxed rooftop sets where people just like, some are vibing to the music, all of them are talking a lot. And it feels a bit strange when you know like the concerts and the music from Fred again, and then you see people just talking. And it's like, it seems strange when you watch it, but now that you think about it, like, okay, yeah, that actually makes sense. It is about the atmosphere, it's about the interaction, it's about having a human-to-human connection. And I think there's a lot to it. It's just interesting how it changes. It's also like, because he writes in the post-pandemic world, IRL is the new counterculture. It reminds me of our conversation with Jack in the last episode, like where new subcultures emerge. And the thing for me is always, if we like right away say, oh, this is a new subculture, then it probably isn't one, because it's not moving away too much from what is the mainstream right now. But if this like, oh, this feels strange, this feels like, why are people doing this? Why are people going to bakeries to hear good music? Then I think we are onto something where there's new behavior emerging, and it's an interesting development.
Yeah, and I mean, I think as always with these kind of things, it's fairly easy to coin a term that encapsulates a certain behavior. How sustainable that term is compared to the conversation, like, to proper counterculture or subculture kind of like behavior is a whole different thing. Nonetheless, I think there's something to that. And, we're not necessarily doing ourselves a favor by looking just in European capitals for kind of like the development of those things. Like, Yusuf had actually a really great example of his time during his stay in Dar es Salaam, where he went to an event, Hello Jua, which kind of started 5 a.m. and runs until 10 a.m. And you arrive there and you get handed a bowl of soup to
chicken mushroom soup.
Chicken mushroom soup that gets you kind of like started. I think that's certainly like, I mean, when I read it, I was like, wow, that's like clean eating bar 25. And I think for places like Berlin, it's always hard to kind of like get away from its past of being, the proper rave capital, where that definitely is connected to a lot of like intoxicating substances of all kinds. I think we're definitely doing ourselves a favor by looking to voices that are outside of the usual kind of like capitals and kind of looking at what is happening there to find also proper examples that are not centered just around sourdough. So I think it's an interesting kind of umbrella term, and we'll definitely be watching it over the course of 2025. We also will be watching a lot of behavior in news media because, like everything else, a lot of things are changing. And I mean, we've been doing when we were running Third Wave, most of our work has been associated with media in some form or another, either by directly working with media clients or talking to our clients about how certain media behavior works. And I think that example that you brought today that caught your attention, Johannes, is a really interesting one because it's actually, even for the ones who are watching that space quite keenly as we do, it came a little bit as a surprise how certainly Wired and The Verge are the kind of like two editorial brands that are delivering the kind of news that you need in the age of Trump.
Yeah, for sure. So Kara Swisher, if you don't know her, she is a very famous Silicon Valley reporter, known for her very abrasive style that all the Silicon Valley dudes like seem to get a kick out of if she annoys them and yells at them. I don't know. There's a whole lot of psychological part there. But she did an interview with Katie Drummond. And Katie Drummond is the recently hired global editorial director for Wired. And I mean, if you listen to this, I'm pretty sure you know very well what Wired is and its legacy as a very technology optimistic medium. But I'd say in the perspective from now, also some like dark history of promoting like a techno optimism that could also be very reactionary, very Californian ideology and these kind of topics. But Wired has emerged, like you just said, as one of those on-the-money journalistic outlets who are really investigating what's happening in the US right now, especially with Doge and Elon Musk's work in and through the government. And it's interesting, and Kara Swisher asked Katie Drummond about that, like how did that came about, and that was super fascinating because there's a couple of interesting approaches, especially when you always hear the like, nobody saw this coming and how could you have known and how could you have prepared? And I think this is a good example. So Katie Drummond joined Wired in, I think, August 2023. And one of the first things she did, so she has a long career. She actually started as an intern at Wired in 2009. And then in the meantime, she did a lot of work for Vice, was like their global editorial director. She did a lot of work or she was a deputy editor for Bloomberg. She was at, let me see.
It's in context.
The editor-in-chief at Gizmodo. So she really is at this intersection of news, like with Bloomberg, and Vice, like alternative approach and technology with Gizmodo and Wired. So she has this mixture. And one of the first things she did at Wired was hiring a political team. Back then in like autumn of 2023, she was expecting mostly AI in the form of fake news and misinformation to influence the US elections. And it's like, so she always understood that technology is political. I think that's the main part that she really understood. It's not like you don't have a technology beat and you have a politics beat. These are merging. I think that was her main insight from her work. And that's why she then asked like Condé Nast global head of content, Anna Wintour, if she could hire a political team. And she actually did. So she hired 3 reporters and 2 editors to build up that team, not really knowing where it would land this year, but that's how she prepared for that and started to do the work. And the other thing is that she has this strong understanding of like beat reporting. So most technology outlets, news outlets, they cover everything. Like they cover everything, all the news releases. And that's why they always feel very shallow, because they, to a certain extent, like reiterate press releases. But her approach is very different. She hires people who are very good at one topic. Like she hired one woman who wrote a whole book on Elon Musk and all his behavior and his takeover of Twitter. And she hired that woman to just report on Elon Musk and go really deep on that. So that's how she prepared kind of for the situation. That got her and her team at Wired to a level of competence with that they now can, like, they do these stories every day, every week. They really go deep and get a lot of coverage. So, for example, they did a lot of stories on these young, not kids, but these young men who are like part of the Doge team, who now go into all these different parts of the administration, get access to like secure data and things like that. And they really like try to find out, who are these people? Where do they come from? What's their ideas? What have they put on Twitter and things like that? They were the ones who like really uncovered that and who go deep into that. And it's interesting, like just from what it did for Wired, just in the first 2 weeks of February, Wired gained 62,000 new subscribers in the US alone. So they're doing a lot of the investigative reporting for that. Just to sum up what's so interesting in there is she definitely took bets. Like she made judgment calls, say, I think this is where we're going with this based on all the things I've learned over the last couple of years. I'm going to bet on this and hire a political team, 5 people. She just hired another famous journalist who is known for doing these investigative, controversial topics that others are not trying to touch, but they at Wired think they have the competency to look into that. They, with the fundamental insight that the technology is political, that this is so important. This is what I think a lot of like German media is still missing. They have the technology book or chapter in their outlets, but they don't make this connection. I think this is why a lot of the AI reporting in German media is horribly shallow and always like basically a repetition of the same article with different examples every year. And then this whole idea of like the beat reporting of like we focus on a couple of things and we really go deep on that. And this is how our reporting becomes like essential for everyone, not just like the technology.
Yeah, I mean, it's very distinctive, right? I think like it's very recognizable in its voice and its kind of position. And as you were saying, like Wired has a long history of being an outlet of, being very pro Silicon Valley, being like idealistic on the potential of Silicon Valley to transform the world for the better. It's, first of all, I think it's a really remarkable transformation on the brand side, right? So when the Nasdaq acquired the magazine a long, long time ago, and the fact that, and it underwent a lot of like changes, and I have to admit that before Katie Drummond was hired, it also kind of disappeared from my radar. like other outlets like The Verge when it comes to reporting and just, having good stories about what is happening in technology took over because they already understood that there's a certain kind of they understood a certain need in the public that we need to investigate, the idea of what technology can be in Silicon Valley specifically, from a more thorough point of view. And to give you an example, and I know we sound a little bit like we love bashing German media, and to a certain degree I do, but it's because it's also so easy. Like a couple of months ago, I bought an issue of Brand 1, which on the face of it kind of like really went into the right direction because it appeared on the cover that they would be investigating Silicon Valley from a different point of view. They're like basically questioning the premises of technology as being a utopian tool. And one of the stories that kind of like I was really looking forward to was the profile of Esther Dyson. And I'm mentioning this especially in this context is because Esther Dyson was also involved in the creation of Wired. And see my kind of utter surprise in an issue that is supposed to be critical of Esther Dyson, the profile of her and Brand 1 was more or less from a fan kind of like perspective. Like the author was kind of super frank about the fact that they've known each other for 25 years. He is kind of like basically profiled her now work outside of technology, without ever mentioning the fact that she was super closely associated with Newt Gingrich, a Republican that is famous for, a lot of things that we don't...
Starting all this shit,
kind of. So that's a kind of like a loop here. And she is very much like, I'm not saying like she did a lot of amazing things, but she is very much a person that if you investigate her right, you can tell a story of a juxtaposition, of a tension, where people had great ideas, but those ideas, by not looking at them as political ideas, became very harmful ideas in the long run. Brand 1 kind of failed on that term. And here's an example of a woman-led magazine, also Brand 1 is too, that is making a surprising turnaround in terms of news, but also for me, it really kind of like, it's an interesting thing where the product, the outcome, the journalistic work is changing also my perception of the brand and my idea of how I want to, how do I interact with it. So kudos to Wired, but also in a way, kudos to Condé Nast for kind of going along with it too.
Yeah, and like you said, our like perspective is not to just bash German media, but to really challenge them to do a better job. And I think there is so much about how in Germany technology is understood is based on just shitty reporting that never questions what's really behind it. That either is like just like, the shit that I've gotten for criticizing Elon Musk the last 10 years. And then and just pointing out, like I remember, like even only a few years ago, they're like glowing portraits of Elon Musk in Der Spiegel and in these outlets. And you're like, you're not paying attention to what's happening there. And for me, the interesting part about Wired is they are getting a lot of pushback from the administration right now. Like Elon Musk is on a personal vendetta against Wired. And they welcome that because they say, we are not partisan. We're just doing our job and we're doing it thoroughly. It's not our job, and it has been of most technology reporting for too long, to just repeat the press releases and the keynote statements of those tech moguls. We are really going deep. We are just looking behind the curtain, and we would do that with every administration, and that's very much needed. And this is why we can stand behind it, and that's why we don't have anything to hide. And I think, and the good part is that it's also a good business case. Wired didn't go so well for a long time. And then now we're seeing these subscriber numbers explode in just a couple of weeks because everybody's like, yeah, this is what we're needing right now. And it shows that like really good investigating reporting that understands it's not so important to go broad, it's important to go deep on the important issues, do a really good job, hire the best people for it, and it makes business sense. I think that's a good part that we can take away from that.
All right. Well, as always, we thank you for staying along for a ride between wrestling, soft clubbing, and political reporting by a tech publication. I think, we can make it easy and just talk about one thing, but I think that's the interconnectedness of the world that we inhabit, that we're seeing, that we are fascinated by every day. It can bring us down sometimes, which is also okay. But for the most part, I think staying curious and attempting to at least see more of the patterns instead of just single individualized kind of like news items is a really good way of finding mechanisms to deal with the complexities of our world. So thank you for your attention. If you like this episode, please recommend it to your friends. Please recommend it not on Twitter or X, but somewhere else if you like that.
Blue Sky, Mastodon, Threads, whatever is your channel.
Thank you.
Have a good one.
See you next time.
Stay safe.